Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney with Dr. Nathan French. Today we have a special guest with us. We have Dr. Bobby Duke. I had the pleasure of meeting him in DC this summer, and he told me about a project that was almost released. And I said, we got to have him on. It's nice that I got to meet him, spend a good amount of time with him over the course of a couple of weeks. And I can tell you he's not just a great scholar, he's a great man. He has a great heart, love for his family, love for people. So it's a huge bonus to have people like that on. And so we're talking actually specifically about a new publication that just came out, Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic Dictionary. And you might be asking yourself, do we really need a new one? Well, when you told me about this project, I knew we do need this one. This is exciting. He's got some new features in this that you're not going to find in any other lexicon or dictionary. So that's primarily what we're going to discuss today. And I will say, for those of you on our podcast audience, there are a few times we're going to reference some visuals. Don't worry, you'll understand it all on the audio podcast platforms, but you may want to hop over to YouTube if you want to see some of the pictures that we do reference regarding what his entries look like and so forth. Without further ado, I'm excited to talk with you, Bobby. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Matthew and Nathan, thank you for having me. And it is just an honor to even share this resource with the wider world, and realizing it was made for a very intentional audience. But honestly, I wrote it because I was asking myself, what would I have wanted to have back in the day that I didn't? Now, hopefully that's helping others.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, let's start with you first. Would love to hear, how'd you get into biblical studies and what's your passion within this field? In fact, you, again, very interesting. You do academic work, you do museum work. So you have a really kind of unique what your life looks like. So maybe you can paint a picture of what's your involvement when it comes to biblical studies. And then maybe end with just a brief elevator pitch for your book before we go into a deep dive of it.
Sure. Well, again, I would say when I was growing up, I did not ever envision myself writing a dictionary. I really didn't see myself in the academic world. When I was young and I was in sixth grade, I felt a very strong call to ministry. And when you're in junior high and you feel a call to ministry, you really think there's only one outlet, and that is by going into the pastorate. So all through junior high and high school, I never wavered on that, went to Multnomah University in Portland, Oregon, and then found myself my senior year in Portland. My college roommate died suddenly of a heart attack, and I was in a moment of just kind of wanting some new direction. I'd been in ministry for a couple years at a local church, and just with that tragic moment, I just needed to take a step back. And I happened to be at a conference on apologetics in Portland, Oregon, that J.P. Moreland from Talbot University or Talbot Seminary and Biola University is from. And I honestly, to this day, cannot remember one thing he said apologetically. But what I do remember is he put a slide up where he just referenced, just in passing, John Wesley's address to clergy. So he put up this slide that John Wesley back in the 18th century said that what does it take to be fit for ministry? And he gave this huge list, which included a lot of the liberal arts. Like, you need to know math and history and science and on and on. But then he focused in on this section of you need to know the biblical languages. Well, I had a lot of Greek when I was at Multnomah. But I hadn't had Hebrew, just because the professor who had taught Hebrew actually ended up retiring and then passing away. They hadn't replaced. So there was like this window there of like zero Hebrew, which has been changed now. I mean, Carl Kutz and Becky Josberger, there's others at Multnomah that have really elevated the Hebrew studies there at Multnomah University. But I heard that quote from John Wesley, and I said, here I am in a time of just needing to have something new. I wanted to learn Hebrew. What better place to go than Jerusalem? So I sent off applications, and it was actually Jerusalem University College that responded to me very quickly, and I was accepted and went starting in 1996 all the way through 1998, and did 2 years at JUC.
Excellent.
And any of your listeners, if they're looking for some place to see the land and really deepen their knowledge of biblical geography, history, and all that, I can't recommend JUC any stronger. I mean, it was fantastic. But the world of scholarship, and particularly the world of Hebrew, just opened up for me in new ways. In a class on textual criticism, that Sephora Talshir's taught. We got to read Emmanuel Tov, and I had Emmanuel Tov's first edition. I think his textual criticism now has gone through 3 or 4. It's gone from blue cover to green, brown cover. I mean, it's fun, but just really fell in love with it. And I would say it was God's way of showing me that ministry can look very differently as doors are opening. And from that time, I met my wife in Jerusalem. Actually, our first date was to hike the Mount of Olives at sunrise and watch the sunrise over the old city of Jerusalem. So,
all right, now you're just showing off. Okay.
Exactly. I'll drop the mic at this point and move forward. But it was just one where then I spent 2 years right after we got married. Both Jenny and I taught at a Christian school. I taught 7th grade. She taught 5th grade. And it was honestly probably the best 2 years of my life when it came to pedagogical training. Because if you can keep 7th graders engaged, honestly, keeping college students is pretty easy.
Yes, it's very true.
So it was one of those 2 years were great, but I realized 7th grade teaching Bible and math and history at a Christian school was not ultimately where I saw myself. And I was sitting next to a Rotarian at a blood drive who said, "Would you want to go back overseas?" And the doors opened for me to go back to Hebrew University and study for a year under a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship.
Right.
And then it was that year in 2000, 2001 that the doors opened for me to go to UCLA. So really it was this moment where John Wesley, with this address to his clergy back in the day, kind of opened up a new insight for me for how important the biblical languages are. Yeah. And honestly, for me now, just like what a joy to be on that journey. So I think your secondary question there was, so give the elevator speech for the dictionary. It really began as a project that I had in the back of my mind for years, but it wasn't until COVID that I had the time to do it. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Los Angeles County, where our family lived at the time, they had some of the harshest COVID lockdowns in the nation. So here our whole family were doing online meetings. And I thought, you know what, I've got to have something that keeps me grounded during this time that is so emotionally gripping for all of us. So between meetings, I would have 20, 30, 40 minutes. And I said, I'm going to revive this concept, put together a prototype and send it off to some publishers. And Zondervan picked it up. So really the passion for this, my passion for this dictionary was to provide the resources I wish I would have had as an intermediate Hebrew student. What were the things that if I had had access back then, I would have advanced quicker in my knowledge of Hebrew in areas that I was always having to cobble together.
Oh, it's fantastic. Oh, very good. I love the elevator pitch. And it's so good to hear your story about how you got into scholarship and how you ended up in the field that you did. I think it's so good for our listeners and even for some of our present students to hear that, yes, this can be a calling and that the Lord can call you in this direction as far as the languages are concerned. I know Mati and I have both had a mentor in both modern and biblical Hebrew, and she used to always say every great revival in the history of the church begins with a return to the languages, and I think that it's very precious, very true at all times. And so here's the next question we have for you. This is a legitimately innovative dictionary of Hebrew and Aramaic with a number of distinctive features. So before we do this deeper dive into some of these elements, can you give an overview of these features of the dictionary? So what are the features of the dictionary? How is it different from other lexicons? Yeah, so other dictionaries.
Right. Well, I know we had a graphic of it, but I was really inspired by what's called the multi-dictionary or Rav Milon that was published many, many years ago, and it was for modern Hebrew. But the goal of that dictionary was not just to give a word and give a definition, but to actually put that word in context. So when I thought of that concept, so if we go back, Madi, to the very first slide where it shows the multi-dictionary, right there. It was one where it would give a definition, but then it would also use that word in context and explain some of the parts, whether it be a verb or a noun, whether it be a preposition, to show how that was actually used in its different forms. And what I had learned, particularly after my first year of studying Hebrew, is that yes, you've learned these grammatical forms, but then you actually get into the biblical text and realize words don't always show up the way you expect them to show up based on 1 year of grammar. And you start realizing Are there vavs or yods that are in places that you didn't expect? Are there endings that you stick this ending on and the word gets squirrely? In the lexicons that were accessible, again, BDB and Halot and all of those, they would at times give some of the other forms that you could see if you were there. But again, they were so focused on historical linguistics and on the connection of Hebrew to other Semitic languages. Those are too dense. So first year Hebrew, you have your glossary in the back of the book. You have some of these word lists. And then you jump to these lexicons. So my goal was to try to hit that middle ground to find those students that now have enough grammar that they can actually start realizing that it doesn't always look the way I would want it to look, but then can start digging deeper. So some of the features of the dictionary that I found for me innovative and was inspired by this modern Hebrew dictionary, multi-dictionary, was that words were now looked at as individual words rather than just being nested under their root. So the lexicons that we're familiar with, they're all nested under their root. So therefore, if you have a noun that begins with a mem, all of a sudden you may have to look somewhere else in the dictionary to find it. Whereas I intentionally said, let's take each word. I will give the roots there, and there's a root index in the back of it, but let's take each word on its own. So for example, in the verbal system, I wanted to make sure that a student can look at the noon and go through and see all the nifals right there. With the hitpael, they're at the end of the haze. So these words are actually kind of disaggregated from how they have been done in lexicons, with a sense that a student can actually just sit down with the noon section of my dictionary and be exposed to every nifal in the biblical text that is used 10 times or more in the nifal form.
Excellent.
And therefore it
That's
helps.
really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing that repetition, I think, is what really helps set in the pattern, right? Because you can learn the pattern. This is how Nephal works. Here's the paradigm. But ultimately, I found for myself, seeing many examples of the same pattern, that's what really sets it in. And to your point, even though BDB was extremely root oriented, even more modern ones like Halot or Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, when you get to the verb part, it's still root based. Right, you find the root, then it will divide into kal, nifal, hitpel, and so on. So it is very different for you to actually say, all the hitpels are going right there. And so in terms of acquiring confidence in how hitpel looks and feels and sounds, you see them all there together. So yeah, anyway, that is definitely a different feature.
Yep.
One of my favorite features that you get into in this book, because there's actually quite a bit. I guess I don't even know if you want to still give more overview, or we can just start diving into more of these.
Well, let me even talk a little bit about taking a step back of.
Yeah.
So how did I pull this all together? Because it did start with Evan Shoshan, and maybe later on we'll talk a little bit about just my absolute respect for Evan Shoshan. It was already great just because of his concordance, but then it went even higher. But in some ways, I was looking at all the resources out there. So I was looking at BDB and Halot, but I was also looking at the various books like the Pratico and Van Pelt or others that are the word lists that will hear words that are 10 times or more, 5 times. So for me, it began with going through Evan Shoshan and identifying every word or parts of words, because Evan Shoshan is kind of nested together. How many of them are 10 times or more? So even I went through, and it took that first few weeks was me just going through Evan Shoshan and circling all the words that I was going to include in the dictionary. Well, then from there, the next step was to then create the entire dictionary when it came to how many forms I was going to use. And what I wanted to also make sure is that my count was correct. Because if you do look at the various word lists, they don't always agree. So I'm pretty confident that my counting is probably one of the more accurate, but there were times that Halot, BDB, accordance, the word lists never agreed. And sometimes they were quite shockingly different. Wow. So I would say an ancillary project is now even to correct. Evan Shoshan needs some correction, but it's not. It's shocking to me what he was able to do with the resources they had back when he did it, without the computers and everything. So it went through there. Again, I think what's made it hard to kind of categorize the dictionary completely is that I am pulling from all of these resources. So I think I have a slide there that it shows that really I'm pulling from all these resources to create something truly, truly unique. As you go down, I think a couple more, because here's some of the other resources I used,
Sure.
these various guides. But if you jump down where I show all of the resources, keep going right
Right
there.
here.
It was me pulling from all of these resources to get something that nests all of these things together. So hopefully it's a one-stop shop. Not to say I'm trying to replace all of these books, but it can be a little bit more for that intermediate level student, a one-stop shop that you can come and that you can get exposed to the data that you're getting from the word list. You can get some of the data that in the lexicons that they give some lists, but mine's exhaustive. So when I give the various forms underneath a noun or a verb, it's completely exhaustive of how many of those forms. And that's what took the most time, is I had to go through Evan Shoshan and Accordance and match them all completely to make sure that all of my, under a verb, all the infinitives were there, and then the perfects and the imperfects and participles and imperatives. But a student can actually sit, look at one entry, and look at the word in context, and then go through each part. So really, I would say to kind of close down this question, it was a goal to try to bring all of these things that I had to buy 5 or 6 books for, to buy one, so that the student can really advance in their language acquisition. That really was my ultimate goal, is how to make it simpler for students to get a sense and a feel that they are more expert at Hebrew. I would say Hebrew is one that just when students are at the place where they can really start making great strides, the resources either get too strenuous, or for whatever reason they just kind of get frustrated with where they're at. So this is a goal to try to make it as user friendly for them to continue to love Hebrew, take that passion they have when they first start learning Hebrew, and keep that passion going.
Excellent.
No, that's a great point, because I think one of the challenges for intermediate students is, you've already done a lot of heavy lifting going from 0 to 1, if you will, right? Like, I don't know anything to I'm in the game. One of the best ways to get better at biblical Hebrew is to actually read the Hebrew Bible. It's fun, it feels meaningful, and it's one of the best ways to advance yourself in the language by seeing how does the Hebrew language actually work. This can feel intimidating, though, to try to do this by yourself. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to start a brand new Hebrew Bible Insights cohort that's all about reading the actual Hebrew Bible in the Hebrew language. I started 2 cohorts, one for the intermediate level and one for the advanced level. And if this is something that sounds interesting to you, where you'd like to get together online with a small group of people, people about your level, reading the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible, discussing things that are interesting to us with me as your guide, I would love for you to join. So if that's interesting to you, we host those on our Patreon page, and you can check out a link in the description below. Would love to see you there. One of my favorite features of the dictionary that I think is really unique is the inclusion of other ancient Hebrew sources, such as inscriptions and Dead Sea Scrolls. So maybe you can speak a little bit to first off, what's the value of engaging in these sources? But also, what does that look like in this dictionary for someone who is an intermediate student of the language, and they're just used to biblical Hebrew as just Bible stuff, right? And maybe they haven't, like, what would that look like in a dictionary? So maybe you can kind of walk us through that.
Right. So in each entry, when it was available, and this is where I could not have done this without Accordance. Other Bible software, I just am a huge Accordance user. So shout out to Accordance. But for every word that I was including in the dictionary, I would do a quick search in the Hebrew inscriptions module that Accordance has. And I would do a search in the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. So their Qumran module they have in Accordance, to see if that word in that form showed up anywhere. Because my goal was to give students exposure not just to pointed biblical text. So that's always the first example under any entry, is the pointed biblical text. But then, if possible, to give them that word also in Paleo Hebrew and in unpointed Dead Sea Scrolls text, for the simple reason that my year at Hebrew University, I took classes, and there was a huge assumption by some of my professors at Hebrew University that you could read unpointed texts. Or there was a huge assumption that you had some exposure to non-biblical inscriptional material so that you would actually see Hebrew in its context. Rather than just being this holy language, it was actually put in its context so that you could get exposure. Now, I had to just choose one Hebrew font, and Chris Udd, I give a thanks to him because he gave us permission to use his font for the dictionary. So again, the Siloam Tunnel won't look exactly like that if you actually go see the Siloam Tunnel inscription that is at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, Turkey, but it's close. It's close. Because the goal again was to have one Paleo Hebrew font so that if students end up going beyond the intermediate stage and then do go on for further master's level, PhD, or others, that they now have some exposure. So they will not feel a sense of fear or fear going into that, but they will have some sense of, you know what, these letters are recognizable because I've looked at it. And I tried to make the examples very simple. And one of the features that I did is I tried to only choose examples where that word is used in context with other words that were also in the dictionary. So there are a handful of times where I have a little asterisk on either the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Paleo Hebrew, because I had to include one where there was a word that does not show up in the dictionary somewhere else. But I tried to be very intentional to make sure that a student then can go look up those other words in the dictionary somewhere else. But that was labor intensive too when it came to tracking all of those down. But I will say for me, it was fun. I mean, it was fun even exposing myself again to the Paleo Hebrew and the unpointed texts that are there. Well, one feature too that even showing the slide is I also found myself in graduate school at the more intermediate to now advanced level, always finding myself defaulting to the English name for the biblical books. So in each entry, when I have whatever book of the Bible I use, I will also give it in its Hebrew name and the way that they often will do the numbering system and the referencing system in Hebrew, and then have the English component, so that, again, a student starts realizing Tehillim, Mishle, Iyov. I mean, they're hearing these and seeing these words constantly.
I think that's
and
so.
The Lord saw that it was good. And the Lord saw that it was good.
Amen to that. No, I love that too, because it's true. Even I did my master's at Hebrew University, so even saying katal or yiktol is just so natural to go this direction as opposed to perfect or imperfect. And it's what I love about this dictionary is it does bring, I think, sort of a more this is where the field is at when it comes to using these terms. It really brings the students up to par, I think, with how terminology is being used. And I think your dictionary is going to go a long ways to bring students to a much higher level more quickly in that way. So one of the goals of your dictionary is to, and I'm quoting here from your introductory matter. So helping, and I quote, helping students see the diversity in the ways Hebrew and Aramaic words exist in the Bible, end quote. So you've already spoken to this, but conceptually, maybe we can talk about this a bit further. So why is this so important, and how does your dictionary help students really accomplish this?
Yeah. Somewhere else in my intro, I make a jest about how in your first year of biblical Hebrew, you're told all the rules, and then your second year, you're told, yeah, those rules don't apply here. It's like the rule book gets thrown out. And I will say that I think it would help for students to see the diversity earlier on, so they realize that words will not always show up this way. So even one of my goals for even including the Paleo Hebrew is to show how very few of these Paleo Hebrew texts have any vavs and yods being used, well, as vowels at all. So you're seeing this word like cold voice that was in that previous example from the Siloam Tunnel inscription. It's just Kof Lamed. It's just those two. So it was to help students get more comfortable that things don't always fit the rule book the way we learned in our first year biblical Hebrew textbook. Yeah, often when I would encounter some of those, the answer was, well, it just happens that way. Or to quote like ma lasod, what to do. It doesn't always. So,
Yeah.
one of the goals was to show students that, okay, here's how this word shows up. And there are places where I'll give the word and then I'll have kind of a slash and give another word. They're the same grammatical category and they would be parsed the exact same way, but they look different. I would say particularly in the verbal system and areas of infinitives or others. I mean, sometimes letters drop out, sometimes they're there and then they're not there. So I would even say that this might even be a resource down the road for those who are doing a lot of kind of diachronic development of Hebrew, to at least have a resource to look back at, to quickly get a sense of how certain words showed up, that then would move them into directions. Because every time you see those slashes, you could ask that question: why was there a difference? Is this a different from a different time? As, like, let's say people like Gary Rensburg and others will often talk about Judean Hebrew versus Israeli Hebrew. But again, it starts providing data quickly sitting there that it's hard to sift through. So really, the goal was to give students more comfortability that they can look at something, understand what it is, even if it doesn't look exactly like the form that they learned in a paradigm their first year of biblical Hebrew.
That's good.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I feel like understanding diversity of any sort, right? Forget just language. Experience is the I think the most straightforward, best way to do that. And I think one way with your dictionary, the fact, like you said, you have when possible, you have a biblical example, pointed biblical, while where most are familiar, but you're also going to give an example from unpointed Dead Sea Scrolls, from Paleo Hebrew, and instead of only, hey, let me just tell you, guess what? It's different sometimes, or explaining the grammar of it. Every entry is, let me show you, let me show you, let me show you. Here it is. And I think it's an engaging way, by the way. I think it's exciting to see, wow, like you say exactly where this is pulled from. Like, this is from the Solomon inscription. Cool. Oh, this is from the Pesher to Habakkuk. Cool. And any students who have professors who can guide them, they can find these resources themselves. They can find Shmuel Achituv and read more of the Solomon inscription, right? They can open up their accordance module and check out more of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's just, you're kind of really just cracking open that door, right, to these different realms of Hebrew, Aramaic, and like, come on, it's fun. Here it is. So I think it's great to introduce as early as possible, because I think to me, it makes it more fun, right? Not only more holistic, but I don't know about you, but I find usage really fun. I'm seeing how real people of the ancient past actually use the language in real texts and real inscriptions, and that just feels exciting.
Yeah, no, and I would say even what you've hit there is, for me, I found such excitement when I started reading non-biblical Hebrew also. And I know sometimes there can be a little bit of, well, I've learned Hebrew just for biblical exegesis, but my biblical exegesis is all the stronger when I start asking and looking at how these words are used outside of Scripture too. And I love puzzles, and sometimes these inscriptions being unpointed in Paleo Hebrew, it's like a puzzle putting together, and the lights just come on in different ways. And I'm hoping that for the students who interact with this dictionary.
One of the best ways to go deeper in our study of Scripture is whenever we're studying certain themes, to see how does the rest of Scripture talk about this theme. We can, of course, do much of this in English, but doing this in the original languages is even better, because sometimes the vocabulary that's related to this theme isn't always translated consistently, and it can make it more difficult to trace a certain theme or topic or motif. I decided to do a video course on wisdom in the Bible, and I traced some of the key biblical Hebrew wisdom vocabulary throughout the Hebrew Bible, making connections also to the New Testament and to our lives today. And the ultimate goal is to see, how does Scripture actually use wisdom vocabulary? What is it really describing? And once we carefully describe those examples, how can we responsibly derive deeper principles from them? If that sounds like something interesting to you, you can check that out at Hebrew Bible Insights, our first video course. I have a link in the description below. So let's do this. Let's lean a little bit more into Paleo Hebrew script.
Sure.
There are pockets people who get into Hebrew studies or biblical studies are really fascinated by Paleo Hebrew. There's of course a lot of misinformation about Paleo Hebrew too. But focusing on dictionary specifically, it's really hard to find a resource that will actually present that. And that's obviously one of the key distinctives. You have Paleo Hebrew on the cover of your book and all throughout on the inside. So I wonder if you can speak just a little bit to, again, why include the Paleo Hebrew script, right? Because theoretically you could have had the inscriptions, but you could have just, changed it, modified it into the modern
Right.
Hebrew script.
Yeah.
You could have just left it at that. So why include the script at all? And what makes this script important to learn in general? You have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say I just remembered how excited I was when I saw the Siloam Tunnel inscription in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and I saw other Paleo Hebrew, and even on modern Israeli coins, they will have Paleo Hebrew and the Hebrew characters we're familiar with right there. So even that sense of looking at something and being able to understand it.
Mm.
I think that was my goal too, is that there's enough examples in here in Paleo Hebrew that a student who really digs into this dictionary will get comfortable so that they can actually go back to the original. I would say even things like the accordance module of inscriptions, they are just using the standard characters that we have. But there's something about taking that step back and getting to the organic. Like, what is the organic inscription that's there? And
Mhm.
uh, again, it transitions well to like the Tel Dan inscription, although that's an
Yeah.
Aramaic. But all of these, you're getting a sense for the fact that this is the way King David would have written Hebrew. And I think that was some of it too, is to try to start showing and getting familiarity that Hebrew was not in some BHS font that we all can easily read. So even my
Yeah.
thought that a student who kind of digs into the Paleo or the unpointed Dead Sea Scroll or other texts, it will make their biblical reading even better, because now all of a
Yeah.
sudden, once you get back to the biblical text, you put the training wheels back and you're like, wow, this is easy compared to that.
Yeah.
So I think some of it is kind of ratcheting up the difficulty just enough so that when you turn it back to fully pointed text, like in the biblical text, they're like, wow, this is a breeze.
And sometimes this just came to my mind. I forget which chapter and verse this is in the book of Ezekiel, but sometimes understand the Paleo Hebrew script can actually give us insight into biblical text. Like
Right.
Ezekiel, I think there's some passage where he's told to put a tav
Yes.
on the heads of certain people and not on the others. And it's interesting to note that the letter tav in Paleo Hebrew looks like an X, right? Just like you'd say X marks the spot. He's okay, put a tav on that person, put a tav on that person. And so every once in a while, you run into elements and realizing, yeah, like this is the script that they were using. Like you said, the pre-exilic script. And of course, it's also found in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls too. So it doesn't just go away suddenly. So if you want to access all the Dead Sea Scrolls, you got to know some Paleo too. So I thank you for that. I think it's really exciting that there's a resource that intermediate students can access that introduces them to Paleo Hebrew, but also in a way where it's still about learning the language as a whole, seeing the usage. And this, I think, also, by the way, not just intermediate students. I think a lot of people would enjoy having this dictionary as a way of, hey, I haven't used Paleo Hebrew in a while, or I haven't used it since I learned it. This is a great way to kind of like slow drip coffee, just kind of, get a little daily dose of Paleo Hebrew with my entry of the day, if you will. So I appreciate you
Yeah.
doing that.
You say that, and I this will probably ramp up my nerd factor or something. With the multi dictionary, I have poured myself a cup of coffee because they use the word in context. That like I can just read through the dictionary and go, wow, I'm learning not just a one-to-one. Here's the word, here's its definition, but you're seeing it in context. And
Yeah.
I honestly think you could structure an entire intermediate level Hebrew class kind of using this dictionary as the base, and then assign, hey, for this next 2 weeks, we're going to dig into all the hip piles. And here they are.
Yeah.
They're listed for you all right here. Whereas you could not do that with a BDB or a Halot because of the
Yeah.
way they're scattered about. Where here, they're all sitting right there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what I love with that too is, of course, you're engaging, as we've been talking about, sort of all epochs of Hebrew, and in that sense, it really brings it together in such a unique way. And the experience, and I think that that's really kind of at the heart of this. The experience of it sort of brings us close to what it really takes to engage the biblical languages at such a high level. Like as you were saying, I was thinking, you have to have Halot, you have to have Evan Shoshan, and the other books that you were using, and the accordance modules themselves. I was thinking, this actually might be very good to have on accordance itself, if accordance is listening. It might be a good module to have and to be able to use in that sense. But so what do you hope then that people who use your dictionary will experience on one level? I think we kind of get the sense of what students will experience, but maybe what is your hope behind it? And you have already, but show us some more examples of an entry or perhaps a few from your dictionary.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and say, by the way, this part is one where YouTube will benefit even more. So those of you on podcast platforms, this next part where we kind of break down an entry, you might want to check out the YouTube version, which will be linked in the podcast. So that way you can see an entry of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say ultimately, I mean, my hope is that students will fall in love with Hebrew the way I have, the way you have, and others, so that you can make it something where they feel like they actually can gain mastery. And I think that's the key is, and putting all this data in front of them. And I think a very user-friendly way. It would have been nice to have the font be a little bigger and have that, but there does come a point where a publisher has to decide that 662 pages is about all we can do here. Because if the font would have been even a little bit bigger, I mean, this thing could have hit 1,000 pages
Easy,
very quickly. So I have joked with some people. I said when it was finally in my hands, and just in the way it worked out with me being here in Washington D.C. and flying back and forth, that I actually had friends and family receive their copy before I ever saw it. So they're showing me to it on like FaceTime. But when it was all said and done, it came out to 662 pages. And I was like, well, I'm just so glad when it finally got printed, it didn't come out to 666, because then somehow it would have been censored very quickly. But even as you were showing it, Maddie, the one of my non-negotiables was I wanted it printed right to left, so it was very tactile. That Hebrew is different from even the way you open it. So I'm sure there will be those around who are like, why is this printed backwards? Well, no, that was very intentional, so that you feel and you put yourself into a whole different frame, so that when you travel to Israel, or if you ever buy a standard full modern Hebrew dictionary, you're already familiar with this is the way it goes. Because it was always strange to me as I thought about it that you would have a lexicon that was still right to left or left to right, even though the language was right to left, backwards. But let's see. I think the other part of your question is the example. So even right here in front of us, for all of you who can't see, and I'll try to walk it through, on that top gray bar, you have the word, how many times it's used, the root, or if scholars debated on what root, because there are some words where there is not scholarly agreement. And then the word glossed with the part of speech. Now, I had to be selective because I didn't want it to be overburdensome. So there are certain words where there might even be 5 or 6 or 7 different English words that are sometimes used. So I'm not trying to replace here going to, again, BDB or even something like the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament if you really want to get into the nuances. My goal was to make reading comfortable, and I always chose an example that actually makes sense for the glosses that I used. But you see here, I put that this word was 2,179 times, but I do use a question mark when the accordance, my count from Evan Shoshan, the other word lists don't agree. Usually it's within a few of each other, but I wanted to make sure that there is one, that there is some scholarly disagreement. If I too couldn't come, if I came to what I felt to be a firm conviction on the number, or if I got my count in accordance and one of the word lists agreed, but the other one didn't, then I would remove the question mark so that it was there. Then you have that first thing right underneath the gray box is the example of the word used in context in a biblical text. with the reference being given in its Hebrew name and in its English name. And even using the Hebrew letters in place of numbers. That was something that I found very daunting when I would start even working on, say, Mishnaic or Talmudic Hebrew, and I would find a reference in some grammar or in some commentary, and they'd say, well, go see, and then they would reference, and I had to try to figure out, well, what number is this? So my goal is too that students even get familiar with how letters are used as numbers in Hebrew context, even still today. I mean, the Hebrew calendar system, even still today, uses letters for numbers. Then the next section is all the ways that word shows up. So for nouns like this one, you will have the different plural forms. Then you'll have the construct forms. And then if a construct form has any suffixes on it, all the suffix forms. And then you have the plural construct form. So you have those three: plural, singular construct with suffixes, and plural construct with suffixes. And you can see here that there are actually more ways in plural that this has suffix than in singular. And there were some surprising moments where I would have thought there would have been an example, but there wasn't an example that was used that was there. So that's a feature I think people will have fun, that there will be holes in the dictionary that I use like dashes to say that this does not show up at all in the singular, or this never shows up in the plural, or it has lots of suffix endings, but we don't even have the construct form.
No, clarification question to make sure I remember, or if I remember this detail correct. So this is technically a biblical Hebrew and Aramaic dictionary, right? So so all this information here in that section you just described is as it appears in the biblical text.
Correct.
Not necessarily how the word may appear in Ben Sira or Dead Sea Scrolls or the inscriptions, right? Is that correct?
That is correct. And again, that's where Evan Shoshan came in. And just to kind of go back a minute, there is a slightly, not a ton, but there's a slightly different shade of gray on the top line, whether it's biblical Hebrew or Aramaic. So the little lighter form are all the Aramaic words, but I wanted the Aramaic and Hebrew nested together so people could see words that we have in both Hebrew and Aramaic sitting right next to each other. I wanted them to be able to compare them so that they can see that Hebrew and Aramaic are not that different. I am one who likes to try to find what is in common versus to try to split everything apart. And I think most of the students, when they will be able to see the Hebrew and Aramaic for the words that do exist right next to each other, they'll start saying, well, I do feel comfortable unpacking this. And then as the example you've shown here, then this word does show up in Paleo Hebrew. So I give it there, and it shows up in in Dead Sea Scrolls. And I chose examples that I wanted to, again, pull from other words in the dictionary, but examples where it would make it easy for the students to kind of piece it together. But I didn't want it to be painful. I wanted it to be enlightening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to show anything that's a little different on the verb?
Sure.
Verb entry?
The verbs were without a doubt the most difficult. They were extremely difficult when it came to that middle section. So again, the same thing here, the word, how many times it's used, an example of that word used. But that section there, how it's broken down is you have the infinitives, then you have the perfects, the imperfects, the participles, and then the imperatives. But why these were so difficult is you have a word where I had to account for, let's say it's a masculine third singular, but then it has a bunch of different suffixes, or it's something that is plural or singular. So it was one where it'll take a little time to get used to the verbs to understand them. But again, for this verb, Amar, this is all the forms and all the ways it shows up in the biblical text. And this would not have been possible without Evan Shoshan because he listed them all there. And there are some moments I had to make some judgment calls where I think he put them in one location, they needed to be in another, or if we have words that were very similar. So, but again, my hat's off to Evan Shoshan, and he was amazing.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to ask you how long just that section of your dictionary alone took you. So hats off to Evan Shoshan and yourself following in those footsteps. That
Well,
is,
yeah, I'll unpack even the process. So during that kind of COVID lockdown time, uh, how much was I able to get done? And then like I moved it forward.
yeah.
But my first goal after I went through Evan Shoshan completely and Mark, here's all the words and all the different forms or all the words I'm going to use. I created a huge Word doc with just here's all the entries I've got to then flesh out. Then I went back and I found that word in the biblical text and chose a good example. But it's when I turned the attention to that middle section, there were times it would take a half an hour, sometimes an hour for one entry.
Oh my
It was
goodness.
so detail oriented. So I wish I could show you here, but I even have a Hebrew overlay for my Mac keyboard because I was switching to the SBL Tiro font using the so even there, I would have to, on my Mac, go up and switch the language every time I was doing that to go back and forth. But it was one where once I got into it, I had to just sit for hours on end. I'm a huge baseball fan. I'm excited about the Dodgers, but it was during the 2020 World Series when the Dodgers won. They'll do it again this year. Down with the Yankees. But it was one where I would often get up early in the morning, and on one monitor I would have the Dodger game from the previous night that I did not look at the score, and I'd be watching that while I'd be doing it, because there was part of this that it just took some time and sitting, and just kind of methodically going through and putting the words in there. But I had using the cut and paste function was another thing I used for some of these. I would get the verb and then just kind of paste it over and over again, and then start accessorizing it with performatives or suffixes. But yeah, that was the moment when my good idea and I started doing entries. I'm like, whoa, did I just bite off more than I could chew? And
Oh yeah,
it just took a lot of moxie, a lot of stamina just to get it done.
yeah, and I so appreciate you giving us the behind the scenes. Like people want to know, like, how is this stuff done? People might assume, like, a scholar just sits in the most elegant of libraries, slowly sipping some tea for hours while beautiful music plays in the background. But the reality is like, you got kids and family, and you got to do another entry. And you know what? Let's just get a Dodgers game replay on. I haven't watched, just something to motivate me.
Well, and I would say,
go ahead.
Well, I would say too that I'm sure someday it would be possible, but all the different features I put in this dictionary, I don't think AI could recreate it. I think AI could recreate certain things, but it couldn't recreate all these features together. So it did take a human sitting for a while. So if you find a project you love, be willing to sit.
Yeah, no joke. I think that's something I felt whenever I met you in DC and listening to a number of scholars. I think one thing I was really impressed by, and maybe you can speak to this, is I think sometimes we look at people who accomplish great things and we're impressed by skill. And no doubt, like, the acquisition and application of skill is a very impressive thing. Speaking of baseball, right? The ability for Shohei Ohtani to do what he's done this season is unbelievable. But the thing I was really impressed upon in DC with this gathering of scholars together was how much a lot of great scholarship is just who's willing to do the work, who's actually willing to sit down and not just sit down, but do it again, sit down again, open up the book again, write again, and do the work. And you can have skill, but the ones we heard from are the ones who said, I'm actually willing to put in the hours. And so I wonder if maybe you want to even dive deeper, because I think a lot of people who are listening to our podcast are people who not only love learning, but they see themselves as playing a role in helping communicate, right? Whether they are people who are current or future pastors, current or future teachers, current or future academics. And, they want to create great things that make an impact, right? That's why they're learning Hebrew, because they see this long-term game. As someone who you've had to do these kind of projects, can you maybe speak a little bit to, the reality of, what it takes to be consistent in this?
Yeah. No, I would say, there's a place that just being very organized helps too. That's one, but grit. Really that concept of grit, that you're just going to kind of buckle down and you're going to commit yourself to something. And I would say, and I put this in my intro, that somehow having something that was consistent, that was again something that even took me back to my couple first years when I was studying Hebrew for the first time and fell in love with it during the heart of COVID was so needed. I think particularly when you're going through hard times in life, having something that keeps you grounded is necessary. So I would say, particularly any of your audience that are in the ministry or are in higher ed or others, you're going to go through very, very challenging times, and find those things that keep you grounded. Find those things that keep you, in some ways, focused, so that you don't let your surroundings and your situation then overwhelm you. So I would say, like for me, working on this dictionary every day, between particularly meetings and online meetings and this very impersonal season we were in during the heart of COVID, made me connect in new ways to why did I start doing Hebrew all those years ago? And it was kind of like the way they describe kind of finding your first love again. And it was actually during that same season where I started contemplating, because I'd been put in some pretty significant leadership roles at my university, and I enjoyed those. But it was during that season working on I'm like, this is what I love. So it started giving me permission to say no to things, and to eventually actually step down from some of those significant administrative roles to get back to doing the things that I truly love.
That segues really well to something we wanted to ask you, which is just simply, what was your greatest joy, as well as maybe your greatest challenge in creating this dictionary? And not necessarily related, but the other thing I also want to hear about is a little bit, again, interesting how you do academic as well as a lot of museum work. Can you maybe speak a little bit to what are you doing in the museum world of, relating to biblical studies? And did that play any role in how you went about doing a dictionary, right? Does a man of the museum maybe approach dictionary lexicon work a little bit differently than your pure only academic? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, your first part of the question of like the joy, I think for me, and I kind of put this little quote in my intro too, because I had one of my sons. He would sometimes ask me, "Well, how many words did you do today, Daddy?" And I think somehow, even showing my own children that, like, here's something that I've fallen in love with and I'm committed to. No, I do not want you to ever write Hebrew dictionaries. I'm not showing you this so that you will follow in my footsteps. No, I'm showing you, though, of how you can, in a healthy way, get consumed with something that you're passionate about. So I'm hoping they even witness that, and they find those things in their own world that they will kind of gravitate toward, and have their own moment where they're saying, you know what? I want to also kind of dedicate myself to something the way I saw Daddy dedicate himself to getting up in the morning and working on this. But I would say where the overlap is with even what I'm doing now, because my title is Chief Curatorial Officer. I sometimes joke that it's actually should be Chief Collaborative Officer, because you just have to collaborate across a museum to make anything happen. But really, I saw myself, even when I was having to select the biblical text, when I was having to select which word in the Paleo Hebrew or the Dead Sea Scrolls, if the word was found, because sometimes there may have been 50 examples of that word was used in a Dead Sea Scroll. I wanted to choose the one that hit it the best. So again, you put several Hebrew scholars in the room. They may have chosen a different Dead Sea Scrolls passage to illustrate that word, but I saw myself as a curator. Like, I'm taking where this word shows up, I'm curating it in a way so that this entry is as impactful as it can be for a student who interacts with it. And honestly, I would love to hear from someone that they said, you know what, I have decided that for the next year, I'm going to just look at 2 pages a day in your dictionary, because that would, in 2 pages a day, you would get through the whole dictionary in about a calendar year. And I'm just going to read all the examples you give, because I guarantee if you did that, then you'd go to the biblical text and you'd feel very comfortable.
That's great. So, you started this talking about John Wesley, talking about sort of your call from ministry into a professorship and moving this direction as far as engaging the languages. So maybe this question here is sort of on that level. So how has this particular project of creating a dictionary impacted your own personal walk with the Lord? And how does the study of the languages in this way actually deepen your relationship with Him?
Yeah. No, it's that's a fantastic question, because scholarship for me is, if it doesn't also inspire your faith in some way, then I don't think I would be interested in it. And I will say that this project, I mean, first of all, it made me fall in love with the biblical language even more, but that translates into wanting to then sit down and read more biblical text. And even during this whole project, there was times I found myself saying, you know what, for the next several weeks, I'm going to read this section of Psalms or this section of Proverbs, and really make even my own knowledge of Hebrew that was increased by doing this dictionary, then actually play itself out to reading the biblical text even more. And somehow when you know the original language, because I think our English translations are fantastic, but somehow when you're sitting there reading a psalm and getting into the language, it grabs your heart differently. And I would say this reminded me again. I'm sure I could have the same feeling if I knew Greek at the same level and ended up doing a dictionary like this for Greek, but I'm not going to. I will not be. But no, it definitely made me even issues of gratefulness. My family were incredibly supportive and gave me space to do it, and that made me grateful too. So realizing that a project like this is not just you. It literally was. I mean, my family, we even rearranged vacations so that I could carve out some time to get certain things done when we got to critical moments in the process. So it was a team effort. So though my name might be on the front cover, and I really wanted them to put Bobby Duke on the cover, but somehow you have to be snooty and have names like Robert or whatever. But I will say that it really was a team effort, and to walk with my students through the whole process. And I mean, I really will say, looking back, though there were days that were challenging, the challenge actually was something that made it feel worthwhile. I think anytime someone's done something like, I don't know, running a marathon or climbed a major mountain peak, it was not easy. But when you arrive, you look back and you're saying, I am so grateful for the journey.
That's good.
Wow. I think it's a powerful note for us to end on.
I think so.
This is fantastic. Look, we'll put links where you can get this book in the show notes and description below. Anything you want to say specifically, though, about people who want to get a hold of this book, or maybe connect with any of your other content, whether academic or museum related, that you want to share?
Well, I would say for particularly any professors that are end up using the dictionary in their classes, I would love to correspond and learn on what kind of additional resources could be created. Because I'm even thinking, how could you gamify some kind of scavenger hunt by using this dictionary, that you would need to use this dictionary to get the answers, or what are different exercises or lesson plans that could be done. So I would love to even think outside the box with anyone of like, how could it be instilled into a classroom setting? So, so far I've had a couple conversations like this, and no one's asked me what the Paleo Hebrew says on the front. It does come from the Siloam Tunnel inscription, and it says the water went forth from the spring. And somehow my editor and I, when we thought about that, we thought, you know what, a dictionary is like this spring that you pull things from. So we thought that would be fun. And even there, that I just like how it looks with that kind of Paleo Hebrew, taking us back to the root.
That's really cool.
So good.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Loved hearing your stories, learning about the dictionary, about Hebrew. Been very edifying conversation. And so we look forward to more people getting access to this book. I should have said at the beginning, obviously we got some copies we were able to look through, and it's a fantastic resource. So Nathan, do you have any last thoughts on this?
No, I was going to say the same thing. It's an excellent resource. I can't wait to implement it into the classroom. So I will let you know of other resources and how
please do.
how it works. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to the next time our paths cross.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.